In this episode of The Fog of War, Yaroslava Bukhta, my co-host in the format, and I discuss the experience of recording our episodes in 2024 and the lessons learned from our expert guests. In this episode, we explore the importance of local context in reporting the war in Ukraine. We also discuss which were our favourite episodes and which insights we gained out of the first 5 episodes of this format. As many of you will now know, the Fog of War format appears on IWI, the Information Warfare Initiative channel. At the end of the video, we also discuss our aspirations developing the format further in 2025. So don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on new episodes. Well, before we launch into this conversation with Yaroslava Bukhta, I wanted to share some insights into the research process that goes into every video made, not just on Silicon Curtain, but also on IWI. For the news items especially, I spend a lot of time doing research to ensure accuracy and depth of the content that I create. And one of the most trusted sources for geopolitics and military news is RFU News. It's one of the channels I turn to repeatedly for source information. Their short, punchy, and highly visual format is a great way to absorb a lot of detail in a short amount of time, especially when I'm under pressure and time is at a premium. RFU News operates in more than 10 languages and is followed by millions across the globe. RFU News is a great source for insightful and comprehensive analysis on the world's most pressing geopolitical issues, with a particular focus on Ukraine. As Russia's aggressive foreign policy scales up, it's been vital to be able to turn to objective sources that report on complex issues like cross-border conflict, diplomatic dilemmas, and economic shifts. RFU team does this and much more with deep dives, data-backed analysis, and perspectives often missed by mainstream media channels. RFU News is a solid go-to source because, like Silicon Curtain, its aims are to provide transparent, balanced reporting that resonates with a global audience. The RFU team creates concise videos every day, allowing you to get a nuanced view of the war in Ukraine in just 5 minutes on a daily basis. It's important to note RFU News is not backed by big corporations. They are a team of independent journalists who rely on its loyal audience. I'm proud to support them, and I think you'll feel the same way once you check them out. Right now, RFU News is offering a 40% Christmas discount on all their plans. So don't miss this chance. Click on the link in the description and join RFU News already today. And now we're going to get into my conversation with Yaroslava Bukhta. Welcome to the last Fog of War episode of the year. This one's going to be more of a conversation with my sort of co-creator on these and the main sort of, I would say, sort of creative lead on this format. Yaroslava, we're going to be talking about the format, what's worked, what we could improve, what impact we hope it to have, and of course, what's coming in the following year. So if you're not subscribed, please make sure you do so you don't miss out on any of these. We're going to be producing episodes at least 1 or 2 a week throughout next year. We hope to produce a really interesting body of work looking at the practice of journalism, not just in terms of a hot war, which is going on in Ukraine, but also the hybrid warfare that is going on against the West and how it's putting our journalistic institutions and the practice of journalism, I would say, under extreme duress. Some of it's, reacting, I would say, in a resilient way. Many corners of the media are not, and we hope to examine this, pick it apart, and play our small role in improving journalism transparency and democratic resilience. At least that's my conception of what we're doing. Yaroslava, what's your motivation for this format, and what impact do you hope to have from it?
Coming from, from journalism as a field and coming from academia and than the research into journalism. I think that my take is that we're sort of creating a platform for specialists who are working on creating information and producing information in all sorts of formats with all sorts of requirements on the contemporary warfare through different countries, through different situations, to discuss what they are actually doing, where they stand, and how their personal or contextual say factors are influencing what they ultimately get as a product. And then another like step would be probably to see how it actually results into policies, into what is going on in the world, and why we see certain consequences of what we say we read, and where we stand. And in general, I think that it's a great discussion of freedom of speech, what it is now, journalistic standards, and generally the rules we play by. Because there are a lot of notions, as in like objectivity and other stuff, that journalism still says it plays along, but I don't think that we can still keep going with that. Also, with all the AI, with all the informational tools, with all the propaganda, with all the like fog, informational fog of everything that is going on in the world, I think that it's really essential also for our audiences to understand how certain processes are created, who stays behind those processes, even if we don't see them in, say, names and titles of articles that we're reading, and then to just sort of be more aware of how we consume information and who we listen to and how it influences and impacts our opinions about different things in the world. So yeah, I would say that it's kind of a great intersection of professionals, but then also of those who follow these professionals, and in general, just increased understanding of what is it that we do when we switch on our gadgets in the morning and check the news and what's going on there.
And you're in this unique position of studying the practice of media and journalism. You're based in the UK, you're in Oxford, where I assume lots of conversations happen at maybe a slightly more intense level than that would happen in other places in the country. But you also have these connections. I mean, what was interesting, I think, from the first conversation we had was your absolutely intimate knowledge of the media sphere in Ukraine, its evolution through from independence through Maidan, the emergence of Hromadske and the sort of independent journalism as it emerged from the oligarchic control and ownership. And of course, you know many of the key individuals and their backstories. That was absolutely kind of fascinating because we can talk about media theoretically, but it's something that's built by people, people that have strengths and weaknesses. They may have idealism and values, and they may not, but it's a very human activity. And that to me was absolutely fascinating. Do you think it's important that you have that detailed context, but also this ability to look at it from the outside, both our journalistic practice in the UK and Europe, but also, have that helicopter view of what's happening in Ukrainian journalism as well?
That's such an interesting question, actually, because I was thinking about that in terms of, in general, knowledge and knowledge that we as Ukrainians, not as me as having like journalistic background or media background, but in general, Ukrainians as a public has on, say, warfare, missiles, types of weapons. But I feel like in like the sphere of information, it's sort of the same. I mean, if you ask people who Gongadze is, what the history is behind that whole thing, obviously not everyone will tell you the whole story, but majority of people will, I think. And it's you know, all these events, they sort of were happening in front of our eyes. So I remember when I was 16, the Revolution of Dignity happened and we were following the news. So it's like the whole country was doing that. So for me, it was more like, obviously I got some insights like working within the sphere, um, but it's just surprising to me that in general, I feel like Ukrainians are very well educated in what is going on in their country. And then this and in the sphere of media and freedom of speech, although it's like an ongoing issue, and I won't say that there are no challenges there. Like currently, journalists, for example, are discussing this new law project that imposes certain restrictions and consequences for people for sharing certain type of information, personal information, and endangers journalistic sources, especially for investigative journalists. So this is all still going on, and yet the general knowledge of, say, oligarchy groups who stand behind certain media groups, their connections, and so on, and investigative journalism in Ukraine, they're insanely good, I would say. I mean, maybe okay, it's a prejudiced take. It's more like an insider's take and a personal opinion. I wouldn't say that this is. I don't pretend to be objective, and as we've discussed in many episodes here, it's really hard to talk about any real objectivity. But yeah, I do think that journalism in Ukraine is very, very mature, sort of. And the public is kind of more mature in many ways than people sometimes that I meet here. And then being in Oxford, um, well, you meet a lot of people here who are specialists in their areas, but again, general education about how information on some more global topics is created. It's not always that good. That was a surprise to me. It's probably a controversial take to be saying, but yeah, it is still true. And I think that, again, returning to the question of what we're doing here, it is very important, not just for, somebody outside of Oxford, but for Oxford Smarties as well, and in general for anyone who wants to sort of understand what's going on in general. And on the helicopter view, well, I've conducted a research on Ukrainian media and the work of Ukrainian journalists on the Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine within the first year. And now looking back at what I found, I feel like half of the findings are not there anymore. So it was like a nice capture of generally the picture of the first year and like the sentiments and everything. But even like half of the interviews that we did, um, they just basically diminish many things that came up in those interviews, and that's a natural process. And it's surprising to me that there is not that much attention actually paid to that. But it's really great that the professional discussion is happening also like in Ukraine as well. There are a lot of platforms where journalists actually come together and talk, and it's really awesome.
And let's look at the interviews we've done so far because
Yeah.
it's very difficult to get a format off the ground. But I think we're getting into a kind of rhythm now of doing at least one a week, getting into the cycle of sort of publishing. It's always more complex doing stuff as a team because you have to, talk about stuff. I'm very used to in the last 3 years operating on my own. I reach out to someone, I record, I do this, I do everything. And I think it's very important to also be collaborative and to expand at least my experience of having co-creators and materials. And that, of course, is one of the challenges, not just the fog of war format, but the information warfare initiative, the channel it sits on, has multiple creators and multiple visions of each of those formats. So I think it's a sort of richer and more complex, much more time-consuming experience.
It's really great to be gathering together these different perspectives, even between like me and you. It's my background is in media and journalism and academic research. Your background is very different from mine. It's more like interviewing all those sorts of people, politicians, not politicians, journalists, media makers, and it's incredible, like to breach these experiences together and actually have a discussion on. Okay, so what do we have now? What is going on, and what is it that we see, and why do we see that? Even like today's conversation that we had about this ballistic missile attack on Ukraine that happened this morning. It's 20th of December, and in general, like how people frame it and how media frame this attack So you mentioned that, well, yesterday Zelensky published this post calling Putin dumbass, and then the missile happened, but it was not actually, and you're absolutely right, this is not actually that. And it's still, we kind of stand in this frame of Ukraine does that and Russia does that, which is also a very sort of thing that brings it back to like a discussion of colonialism. And then we still see Ukraine as a kind of like reacting to the actions of Russia, and Russia as a main actor, and then Ukraine through the prism of Russia, and so on and so on. And it's just fascinating how from this like little things and little cases we can actually discover some broader contexts and factors that have been shaped within decades, and then sort of challenge them and see them like as in, what is that? Why do we do that? As in like in, I don't know if you remember, like first episode, Johanna she was talking a lot about effective epistemology and where it stems from. And actually, in one of her articles, she refers to some sources, and they say that it comes from this practice of knowledge production and a general framing of emotions as something bad, and emotions something attributed to women. So it also stems a lot from patriarchy and patriarchal, sort of order. So women are hysterical, emotions are bad, and we can't show emotions. Hence, objective journalism can't have any emotions in that. So this all was shaped like ages ago, and it's really essential to see these things under just immediate reaction or under an immediate situation, and actually deconstruct that in order to change it and to bring systemic changes and discussions of how it actually should be in the world of informational warfare where we are now.
Episodes we've done, which are they're all very different, and I think they all have their own sort of intrinsic value. But I think the most recent one, which the audience may or may not have seen, or we're in the process of trying to upload at the moment, I think I've enjoyed aspects of all of them, especially the George Dream one. Watching that because I wasn't part of recording it, but I have spoken to one of the people who interviewed there, and so that I greatly enjoyed that, and there's some great insights from it. And also the one with Katerina, I thought was incredibly compelling as well. But the one, I really enjoyed most of all is the one that we've just recorded, because it's far closer to my experience, having worked in sort of marketing and heard a lot about communications and crisis communications. And I've always thought about it as a very reactive discipline. Something bad happens and you try to shape the informational environment. I've never thought of it as a values based or even highly moral and effective sort of area. It's always been of technical interest. But this interview with Valeria Vashievshinska, if I can get the pronunciation correct, this really opened my eyes, because when you combine a really smart communication strategy with values, and the clear intent to make a difference, especially for a country at war, this was hugely eye-opening. The idea that you can use communications to change the behavior of a large corporation, in this case it was Unilever, and forcing Unilever out of the Russian market, that quite literally deprives the Russian war machine, the Russian treasury, of tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, if you look at it over the period of the last 3 years. That to me is extraordinarily impactful. And hearing it from the campaign conception to how it's executed to the impact it had, that for me was just extraordinary.
Yeah, that's interesting, because for me it was something that I'm used to sort of seeing within Ukrainian media sphere. Again, also like working for the investigative media. So I used to work as a communications person in Следство.info. And I've seen actually situations where sanctions would be imposed against Ukrainian politicians. For example, if I'm not mistaken, it was after the Следственные investigations that Tupitsky, who used to be the head of Ukraine's constitutional court, a very problematic person and like very basically a corrupted judge, sanctions were imposed against him by the US. Obviously, it's not happening because of the journalists only, but it's also happening because of what they reveal. So it's a very sort of open, well, it's a big discussion between activism and journalism, because obviously if you expose someone, you want some actions to be taken. And this is something that also was an open discussion for my interlocutors when I asked them about the full-scale war context. Because if you work as a journalist and then you expose, say, Russian militaries committing war crimes in Ukrainian villages and cities, you're like, okay, so what now? And it's interesting because a lot of methods that journalists use, such as OSINT, like open source investigation techniques, like they actually become evidence in courts, such as, I mean, it's not new. Again, MH17 investigation has led to a major process that is still going on. And basically, the Bellingcat investigation and how Russia downed the MH17 Boeing over Eastern Ukraine. So yeah, as I said, like it's not something new, but it's really fascinating how these things can impact major changes. But and actually, I wanted to ask you about this aspect because on the one hand, yeah, you have like highly like Valeria is awesome. She's very motivated. She's the sort of right set of values, and we're using it for the general good. The Unilever sanctions. The now she's working on attracting more attention to Russian oil tankers still sponsoring war. But what if those values are not in place? What if it works sort of for the sake of Russian propaganda? I mean, you've interviewed many experts here, also people who worked on propaganda and Russian informational influence. So, do you see that they are also using sort of like same techniques against like the good people? And what can be actually done about that?
It's tricky, isn't it? Because I think, we talking about earlier about sort of systemic issues, and I think the difference between individual learning and systemic learning. And the impression I get in the practice of Western journalism, and this is again my very anecdotal view of an outsider, is that there are individual journalists who operate within the system and understand the system and yet are able to have a unique voice. And because they're very sort of diligent and curious individuals, and I'm thinking here about people like Edward Lucas and Luke Harding, they go out and they research the context. They talk to people, they challenge their own preconceptions, and they have huge background knowledge and a context to their writings. And that's not to say that everything is objective, and there's no such thing as objectivity. But these individuals strive to get closer to or strive for objectivity, I think, through removing or trying to remove the sort of lenses or biases that all of us have. And they do that by getting external information and judging the quality of that information. That, however, doesn't result in systemic fixes because you have numerous correspondents who may be steeped in context, but they choose different sources and different contexts. I'm thinking here, for instance, someone called Peter Hitchens, and he will often quote sort of highly propagandistic Vatnik literature. So, yes, he's widely read, but he's choosing sources that reflect a version of reality that he has in his head, a construct, rather than having the construct be challenged by the sources. So again, but that again comes down to the individuals. But I think the majority or a big systemic problem is as advertising revenue has ebbed away from traditional legacy media, and the challenge of gaining attention in a very sort of clickbait world has come up. There's less money to invest in individuals and in their career paths, and there's less money, which translates into time to produce individual articles. So what you'll get is, and I do this when I research the news, I'll look up a particular topic, such as the oil tanker spill, and I'll get up a dozen or so articles on the topic. And what I'm looking for is what is different in these, because they all typically come from the same sources. They all get the same sort of ticker feeds from writers or whatever it is. And they won't write everything they get from their sources into the article, but they'll choose bits. So I'll have to look at multiple articles to get the overall, okay, this is the main source. Some will then supplement it from their own knowledge. Some will supplement it from reading other sources. Some will supplement it from actually doing interviews with people. So again, by consuming 10, 15, 20 articles, I will get, information that is common to all of them, and then information which actually provides some sort of extra richness that you get. But even then, you have to ask, okay, it might be different, but is it correct? Is it good? And what are the quality of those sources? And that's how I kind of build up my articles. But it also talks about the weakness of the process, because if the majority of news is being pulled from the same primary source, all the journalists are able to do really to impose their own personality and character on it is tweak some of the words and phrases. And if they don't have local context or even historical context, and not even deep historical context, I'm talking about learning the lessons of the last 3 years, they will impose language. And you take a story which may be fairly neutral, and you need to color the language up. You need to get people's attention. So you will fall into narrative tropes, because not that this language describes reality, it's that you have to take reality, the neutral, you know, description that you've got, and you have to put some colorful language in there. And you do that based on your understanding of the audience. You do that based on, lazy assumptions about what narratives have worked in the past. This is where you get words like escalation appearing all the time, So the story mentioned earlier, Zelensky calls Putin dickhead, and the next day missiles hit, and they're like, oh no, Ukraine's escalated again. It's like, no, this attack does not just happen. Physically, you cannot organize an attack like the one that's happened overnight. You cannot just click your fingers and suddenly this falls into place. It takes days or weeks. I'm not a military expert, but I've spoken to experts. It takes days, if not weeks, to plan a multi-front, multi-platform strike like that and to coordinate it all. So clearly that was planned. And then you have to ask, so rather than the strike being in response to something Ukraine did or something Zelensky said, you have to look at the broader context. What is the immediate context? Well, the context is Putin did a press conference. So he had a reasonably good idea of what he was going to say and what he was going to do. So the mechanic there is not an escalation. It's a strategy. It's a strategy where Putin's engaging with international media. You've got their attention. Then you have to follow through with something else to leverage it and to send a message to the international media, to Ukraine, to politicians or whatever, to show what you are, what he is. So this is part of an orchestrated sort of strategy there. And this is what I think, much of the media has a goldfish approach to stuff. It learns something, and then 5 seconds later it's forgotten it, and it slips back into words, phrases, narratives that have no thought, no self-reflection, no examination behind them, and lack context, but also lack any of the learnings from the previous mistakes that were made after Kakhovka, after Bucha, after all of these things where you could go back and examine and say, okay, what did we do right? What did we get wrong? Learn the lesson, move on. I just don't think systemically those things are happening. I'm willing to be told that that's the case, but the evidence I see from the headlines that come out suggests to me there is not systemic self-examination and learning.
Yeah, I feel like it's quite a challenging and very complicated issue. Again, that was partly the reason why I started doing this research, because I remember that when I left Ukraine and then I came to work in to Brussels in media there. So my expectation was that, okay, I'm a journalist coming from Ukrainian background. I know a lot. I know all the actors. I know everything that's going on. So they will probably be using me for a lot of Ukrainian stuff. No, they actually the to a greater extent, yeah. I mean, I was writing about Ukraine, but I was writing about Ukraine, um, especially on the topics that needed Ukrainian as a language. Not because they thought that I had more expertise, but because I had this language availability. Or there was another thing that when I wrote the article, basically explaining why derussification in Ukraine is not such a straightforward and easy process as simply prohibiting all Russian. Um, I think it was like 5 editors that had to read that 500 words thing. So it's not to criticize, and I know where this is coming from because when I was, for example, preparing for the interview with our Georgian journalists with Anna and Katya, which was really great and insightful to me as again like as a Ukrainian, and what they're doing is great. And see, I understand what I'm talking about because this is the path through which my country has been. And that was the situation where I was because I personally, I mean, I have to acknowledge that I do know something about the situation in Georgia. I do read media on explaining stuff about Ivanishvili, about Georgian Dream, about why it is very problematic. We had Saakashvili who was going back and forth between Ukraine and Georgia. So we know stuff about 2008 and Russian war against Georgia. But then now the question is, what do I actually know about Georgian media? Who do I interview? Who do I interview that I can trust that has not expressed any pro-Russian or any dubious views in the past? And one of the things that Anna was like saying was that Western media have to be more cautious about choosing experts. And this was exactly the call that Ukrainian media were making, especially at the beginning of the full-scale war, but previously that you have to choose experts carefully. You can't just take, I don't know, gosh, what's his name? Um, Forgot the name of Ukrainian politician who was very popular at the beginning of the full-scale war. Arestovich. Oh, yeah, this one.
Arestovich,
Yeah, you
you've
can't.
mentally expunged him because his sheer awfulness. Yeah.
Yeah, well, basically, you can't just take this guy and put him as an expert just because he occupies certain position. You can't, and this context is not always that obvious to say people who are outside of the context. And it's not that easy to get, especially if the media sphere you're operating within. I mean, Georgian language is very different from Ukrainian. It's even like the way it's written. So I don't have access to it. I don't know which media are okay, which are not. And all of them actually have history. Same as in Ukraine. Some media are associated with some oligarchy groups, some are not. We have telethon, which is like a major discussion about what's going on there, because on the one hand, it's like many people call it a propaganda instrument by the office of president. On the other hand, a lot of experts who are actually good experts, they still go there because it's their recognition as experts and public faces. So it's a complicated and nuanced thing that sometimes me as Ukrainian, I feel lost in. And then you have like somebody who comes from outside of this context and they need to start reporting and making stories on that. Just having some knowledge, but not deep knowledge. It's not to indulge those who refuse to learn within 3 years and they still don't understand what's going on and they still call it escalation. No way. But I just, I feel like that producing this podcast sort of made me wear their shoes and understand a little bit better why they struggle on so many things because I was struggling with these things. And again, it's not because I don't want to know. It's just that sometimes I don't really have resources or capacity. Also, you mentioned that you read news and you compile them. And this is something I was thinking in terms of the audience. So if you wake up, you open your news, like, do you really have time to like look through all these sources? So we are doing it because we work with the topic and because we are sort of experts within the topic. But somebody who is not, and somebody who just wants to know what's going on in the world in the midst of, like, I don't know, Christmas shopping or whatever. It's hard. It's really, really, really hard to operate within this world's information. And what I was also thinking was when I went to, say, Blackwell's, just wanted to get some books. And I was looking at books written on, say, Syria, Afghanistan, and I kept asking myself, can I trust those books? Because I have close friends, say, who are Afghans, who know very well the context of Afghanistan, of their media sphere, of who operates where. And it's also same complex. They have different groups, different political groups. Obviously, we have like Taliban and pro-Taliban or against Taliban thing, but it's not just ambiguous because you have different ethnic groups, you have different like nuances and political views, you have different influences and stuff. And if you are not deep in the context, sometimes it's just really hard and you feel lost. And it's very easy to fall into this trap of like, kind of snake biting its own tail. We're talking about this recently that um, we are told that propaganda is there's so much propaganda that we can't trust anything. So let's just fall for conspiracy theories because they're not mainstream, and they're less likely to be coming from some governments and this magical thing that we were discussing. But yeah, it's sort of like a challenge for, I feel like, every single individual now to sort of choose your sources and be able to operate within this field. And then, yeah, how you choose your sources, how you sort of choose who to read. And then this context, it came so many times up in our interviews. Literally, if you remember Karina, she was talking about the context. Irina was talking about the context in the first interview when she mentioned working with foreign media coming to Ukraine. So he was talking about the context. We actually went deeper into that when we discussed the story that he published about one Ukrainian village in Western Ukraine and about the story of a family of a man whose basically parents and grandparents were fighting in world wars, and then whose sons and grandchildren are now fighting in the Russia's war against Ukraine. And so he mentioned it very reasonably that it's a very complex context even for Ukrainians. Because I, as a Ukrainian, for example, after the Holodomor, after the couple of wars, after all the repressions, I don't know half of my relatives. Some of them were just repressed. I don't know what happened to them. So we have this like blank sets of information as locals. And then this whole local global divide doesn't make any sense because it's just you have to be willing to sort of dig more into your personal history, your family's history, and at the same time to be willing to analyze what's going on in the real world. And there's nobody to tell you what is right and what is wrong. Like, I don't want to say anymore because has there ever been anyone to be fair? But yeah, we're raising actually super complicated and complex issues here that encourage to a lot of often uncomfortable discussions, uncomfortable questions to ask yourselves as, okay, what is it that I'm reading? Why am I reading that? Do I agree? Do I not agree? If I don't agree, is this wrong? Or a lot of gray areas, such as, again, like freedom of speech, is giving a platform to a Russian propagandist being freedom of speech. Like, what is both sides?
And there's also, other twin processes which we can sort of talk about there. One is normalization, and I fear normalization bias is one thing, but also I'd call it normalization drift as well, which is where you live in extraordinary times and extremes of political opinion emerge, or even when the majority opinion starts to move towards either the left or right or towards extremes. There's a normalization shift where mainstream media tries to maintain the center of balance. If you want to sort of be balanced between left and right, but the entire ecosystem has moved in one direction, well, you've moved with it and you're moving the debate with you, but yet pretending to be a neutral arbiter of that situation. So there's a lot of this delusion that takes place there. And we've had a lot of this delusion, I think, in the years of Brexit. Um, you know, deciding that you can no longer have agency to change a particular reality, even if that reality is patently absurd and demonstrably absurd, and all the facts suggest that decisions have been made that are not based on any objective view of reality, but on highly subjective, highly emotive kind of topics, then you bury it. You avoid those conversations, and I think it's a slightly sort of Soviet feel to the debate that's happened around that. But this is where I would say I started perhaps questioning the media or not feeling quite my, let's say, call it a trust index. My level of trust towards the collective thing known as the media evaporated. And I started looking at individual voices, not necessarily, oh, you go to a publication and broadly speaking, you might be more comfortable with a particular publication. Rather than reading the Telegraph, you might read the Times if you want an established point of view that pretends it's objective, or you might go for Guardian or something. But even then, I come to the point of view that actually it's not so much about the brand as such. It's about looking for individual correspondents and voices, and that's what I tend to do now. I just look for people whose individual voice I trust, and as you said, I go back and look at what have they written about before. Are they constantly, what is their connection to reality? What's their connection to contexts? What is their real world network like? Where do they spend their time? Who do they talk to? Because that will influence the quality of their insights. Again, come back to people like Edward Lucas and Luke Harding. The context of these people is they continuously talk to other experts and question their points of view, talk to Ukrainians, especially. And it's interesting the way that's become sort of fragmented. And media as an institution, I think, is in a process of serious decline. Although those who are inside the system would maybe push back and say, "Ah, that's far too pessimistic," etc., etc. But I'm rather cynical about it at this point.
Well, yeah, I think that I wouldn't fully agree with that. Also, I think a side note, but we should have Luke Harding here at some point after mentioning him so many times. I should tag him. Luke, if you're watching this, please come to us. It's an official invitation. Yeah, so basically, I wouldn't say that it's a decline of media as an institution, but it's a lot of changes that are happening in general about how media work and how information works. So there's this brilliant work that is sort of it's, well, I wouldn't call it a textbook, but it's a great anthropological work on the way images are chosen for the newsrooms. So highly recommended one. I was just rereading it recently. It's Zeynep Gursel, and it's called Image Brokers. So what she does an extensive ethnography on how images in news media are selected, produced. So she actually went, if I'm not mistaken, to AFP, Agence Presse France. She also went to AP. So she actually discusses on how editors produce and pick images for the news that we see. So there's this discussion about this. So if I ask you what picture or what photo comes to your mind first when you think of Afghanistan, what would it be, Jonathan?
So the favorite episode out of all of them would be, I think, the one we've just recorded that's not yet up on the channel again for the reasons sort of stated there, because it sort of opened my eyes to an
No,
activity.
I
Sorry.
asked, yeah, I asked you about the picture about Afghanistan that comes
Oh,
to your mind the first if you think about this country.
I mean like a physical photo or
Yeah, like the photo. Yeah, what would be the photo that you would have in your mind when you think of Afghanistan?
I think it would be quite a whimsical one. It's a photograph that appeared across the world's media a number of years ago of a strikingly beautiful woman with a face not covered,
Yes,
with eyes. But
exactly. That's yeah.
it sticks in the mind because there's also a before and after. She was
Yes,
photographed 20 years later,
yes.
and it's the clear sort of ravages of time and an incredibly harsh life. And I would say that the beauty that was there, the sort of life in those eyes in the subsequent photo is gone, is not there at all. So it's that before and after contrast.
Yeah, so that's it's very okay. I was scared for a moment that you would name a different photo. But it's actually great because Gursel exactly talks about this example and exactly about this picture. So basically how you pick a photo to accompany your news is how you shape the picture of what people see about this certain war. So if we talk about the full-scale war of Ukraine, then like all these pictures of 20 days in Mariupol and this pregnant woman of Malaletka and all of these are the ones that are shaping the image of the world that we know as we know. And then with such a spread of different, because even when the picture of the woman in Afghanistan was taken, online media were not such a big thing. And then you operate in a place where a lot of journalists, they switch sort of to doing YouTube and blogging. And then that question that you were asked, are you a journalist? So like a blogger who follows journalistic standards and then journalists who don't follow journalistic standards, like where do they stand? And like how do we classify that? It's a major discussion, like what determines you as a journalist? Working for a media, but you can be a freelancer working for a media, and that's also like a thing. So it's a major, major discussion that is happening now as well, as in like where do traditional media stand, and if there is any such thing as traditional media. I do agree with you that reading personal or separate individuals working within media or producing certain content is sort of one way out. But then why I mentioned Gursel is that she said that it's not the trust to certain pictures that we have, but it's the trust to sources that publish them that sort of determines if we believe them or not. Because a photo itself is just a photo, but what is needed for that is so basically I think that picture was published in the Times. It was like the cover. So if it wasn't for the Times or if it wasn't for that specific source, would you know about this picture? And that's sort of the same thing that still operates. So if it's not the New York Times or some more renowned like thing that publishes photos, or some platform that actually grasps that context and brings it to the fore, like do you actually know what is going on there? And in general, that's a question of a decline of media attention towards certain contexts. I mean, Georgia still has protests going on, but like the probably the amount of things published in media is like going down. Or say Syria, there's like a very long road in front of this country now, and there is a great question about migrants, about like all of these discussions. But it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen over a week. It's going to happen over really months. And then something we discussed yesterday with Valeria, it's why is Ukraine still at the fore? Because Ukraine is still having like the full-scale war. We were not after 2014, maybe for a bit, but then it was gone. Nobody knew that Ukraine was in a state of war with Russia since 2014. It's like it's a lost history. It has been in war. It's yeah, I mean it's just was the next stage. People keep asking like when will Ukraine negotiate with Russia? Ukraine's been negotiating with Russia since 2014. Ukraine's had treaties like the Budapest Memorandum everyone discusses now. We've had agreements that they
Minsk
just
one,
work.
Minsk two, you
Means
know.
too, yeah. And people are like, when will Ukraine sign any agreements? I mean, we've signed them. They just don't work. And this is the context that we're talking about. And I feel like for media, again, it is essential to have individuals that but again, it's a more like a specialized professional discussion because something that they talk about is that you have a bunch of journalists who work on different topics. So you have people who like say they cover like the grain deal, for example, for Ukraine, and then they move to another topic and then another topic, and then you just sort of keep moving between topics. But then you need to have individuals who work on a specific line for years, and it's pricey. So Sometimes you need to publish stories that will not have like clickbait names. It's also pricey because you need to understand that you will not have as much revenues from ads, say. So you are also like in a constant business of, on the one hand, choosing the images that would be nice to depict the reality. On the other hand, understanding that your money depends on audience attention, and further development of your media depends on how much money you get from audience attention. So it's a very complicated thing. So I would say that, yeah, coming back to the initial point, I don't fully agree that media are in a decline, but I feel like the field has become way more complicated and it needs to be discussed, and new rules for this field needs to be discussed. For example, when we're talking about freedom of speech, and then something happened during the protests in Belarus a couple of years ago where internet shutdowns. And then you have basically, I was curious, how do you do like internet shutdown? So basically it comes to private providers shutting down the internet. So basically a major question is like if we're all operating online, and if there are certain governments who just make private providers shut down the internet, it shut down the whole system. So internet is basically sort of privately owned. And if we move all our lives into the internet, there are no laws on, say, on a global scale that would control that. I mean, I'm happy to be wrong about that. It's just like I kind of was interested about this thing and did some personal research, and that's what I found. Maybe again, maybe I didn't know something, but that's fascinating. Well, fascinating and scary if you think about that.
And I think, from my knowledge, you have to have extraordinary technical
Yeah.
resources in order to create a closed or private system, or at least to edit big chunks of reality out. China, of course, has actually achieved that. It has a certain degree of control over the internet, especially through insisting that Chinese sites are hosted within the system and not outside of it. So there are certain things you can do as an authoritarian system. It's much more difficult if you're a quasi authoritarian or democratic system to impose any control over that whatsoever. Indeed, Russia has tried and failed to create the equivalent of the Great Firewall. It hasn't achieved
Yeah.
it. And their attempts are rather crude. When they tried to block VPNs near the start of the war, they ended up blocking many of the internet communications from their own ministries and their own infrastructure. So, but they've discovered something, I think, which is far more worrying, which is you do not have to have a complete Stalinist system. You do not have to control everything. In fact, there are techniques where you can let people through VPNs and so on access the world's information. But what you do is you try to degrade the trust in that information. You engage in what we often call Russian informational warfare, and it's multi-layered and there's multiple intents behind it. But one key intent is to erode trust in traditional media, erode trust between people and communities, to create ambiguity so that you no longer, you don't see any absolute values. Everything is relative. Is one of the, it's not so simple is one of the key components of that. And then lastly, they seek to ensure that you do not express your agency. You either directly tackle the few individuals who are, I say, extreme expressors of individuality, and you may have to surgically kill them, take them out, do that sort of stuff. But generally, you don't have to. They've discovered that you can be fairly economical with this. And actually, you can invest in informational warfare by creating a sort of choir of lies. You can have different sort of bubbles that you build up, which are, artificially injected or manufactured. Even there, they can still be 60, 70, 80% reality versus, the rest is corrupt. And you get your message across. So they've discovered that you can create an entirely toxic, aggressive media environment with relatively low input, and they've been innovating these techniques, and they continue to do that. My question to you here, and I think this is maybe something we focus on a bit next year as we sort of head to the end of this episode, it's about what we should focus on next year. I think one of those things is is the mechanics of this information warfare and why Western media is so vulnerable to it, because they're used to competing in a competitive environment where you have leftist, rightist, centrist media, you have media owned by different sort of people, you're sort of in competition directly or not. You've got the BBC, which is fairly monopolistic, which sets us previously would set a standard in quality threshold. So you're existing in a competitive environment, but it's a rules-based environment. They're not really geared up to dealing with a system which is entirely aggressive and which has clear intent, very nihilistic intent at its core, imperialist nihilistic intent. I just don't think they're really geared up to deal with that. And this is why we see so many systemic failures. Love to hear what you think and how actually we can try and tackle these topics and what guests we might invite on to talk to it.
Yeah, actually, definitely. It's for sure one of the primary topics that should be in our focus next year. So for those who are listening this, I would also encourage you to leave comments for us to join us in this discussion and to suggest the guests that you probably would be interested in hearing. Maybe some local journalists to you, some Ukrainian journalists, some voices that operate on the global environment, or some, say, specialists that you would like to hear more, because it all ultimately comes up to people and chains of people who operate behind every single thread of information that we have. Returning to the question on guests, I would love, and this is something that is like my personal aim, is to bring more voices and more people from different backgrounds operating in different media systems and different informational systems. So I'm already in negotiations with some people who come from Afghanistan context, from the context of Syria, of Palestinian journalists and researchers. So I think that what we will be growing into is a wholesome discussion on how the world of media and the world of information should be operating and where these rules should be standing. So yeah, journalists, academics, politicians, and those who shape laws and those who have direct influence on the laws related to media freedom of speech. And I want to make it more as a space of debate and, again, like a platform for discussion and bringing together different voices. So actually, it's another encouragement. If you would like to see like people who have already been our guests in dialogue with each other, please let us know, because this is also something that could be of a great interest. And I want to invite more people who are like investigative journalists who work with information on major politicians, and basically they are the ones that are often called like hardcore watchdogs of the profession, and to discuss with them actually um, what is freedom of speech and what is the true freedom of speech. And again, investigative journalists from different environments, because surprisingly, but it seems that Ukrainian freedom of speech in the situation of the full-scale war is way more, say, broad and way more free than many other countries that are relatively democratic and peaceful. Because yeah, Ukraine operating under such circumstances still allows almost all the access to many points, despite certain restrictions in place because of the security considerations. So yeah, there are huge plans, and also we're attempting to do some offline events, and would be great to bridge together some academics again in Oxford for further discussion, for policy papers and further implementations for media development, given the insights that we are getting here from our guests. What are your points, Jonathan?
I think, yes, I mean, certainly that. So my bias is towards people who are engaged in the informational struggle, but also trying to understand, people operating in more of the systemic sort of legacy media. Images, I think we should get definitely more photographers on. I think it's interesting the perception that we discussed in the interview there, the perception is that photojournalism is one of the most objective ways of expressing reality. Whereas, as someone who's interested in photography, it is possibly the most subjective because by taking an image, you preclude a million alternative images. There's so much conscious choice made there. And then when that image is published, there's obviously a lot of pre-processing. Even back in the days of darkrooms, there's a lot of manipulation of that image to accentuate contrast and detail and, put some in focus and maybe soften the focus. So it's one of the most artificial and yet one of the most direct ways of storytelling. So I find that sort of fascinating. And again, a particular photographer might take a million billion images. There's the famous photographer during the Second World War, who's got fantastic, series of images, millions of images that are well known. Don McCullen, I think he's called. And yet the most memorable, the most famous image he took is actually an accidental one because he was on D-Day coming off one of the landing ships, and I think his bag of films fell in the ocean and got waterlogged, and he only managed to rescue a few images. And one of this blurry image of soldiers, wading through the sea, coming out of one of the landing craft, and it's quite a sort of it's a ruined image, as it were. If it hadn't been hit by the water, it would have looked very different. But there's something about the drama of it, the fact that it's indistinct, has made that as an iconic image. So again, there's the conscious choices. There's photographers that, may be much prouder of a whole range of images they produce, but that's not necessarily the one that becomes famous and fixed in people's minds. So yeah, I'd love to do more on that. Information warfare, absolutely. I'd love to get someone like Peter Pomerantsev, who's been on the main channel, but I'd love to get him onto this to sort of talk about information warfare in that context and many others. I also wonder, and this is my last point here, whether, and this is very risky, but whether we should interview people who have been in journalism who we absolutely don't agree with, who we see as maybe more opinion writers and those whose version of reality we absolutely don't agree with, and try and honestly try to figure out how they come up with this and how they publish this and what their thoughts are in relation to it. We may not want to go there, but a lot of the comments always say, well, why don't you get people on who you disagree with, not just those you agree with? I think that could be interesting. I also had a conversation many years ago with someone who was actually a very low functionary within the speech writing team that created the speeches of Vladimir Putin. And I remember going having a beer and talking for hours, and she described the mechanics of how it works. How much effort, how much resource and planning goes into trying to make the Tsar look, inevitable and invulnerable and supremely intelligent. Which isn't to say, for his current decline, that he didn't have, some mental faculties. He's clearly kind of devious but smart, or he was.
Tucker Carlson, we're coming for you.
I'll cut that out. But what was interesting about it is they try to create the impression that this is all him and it happens in the moment, and it's his sheer brilliance doing these sort of 4 or 5 hour press conferences as they used to do at Valdai. But then behind the scenes, you realize there are literally hundreds of people involved, many, many weeks worth of planning and the structure of that. I won't describe the full structure here, but it's really interesting how they do that and the different editorial process. So if anyone listening has ever been part of the propagandistic speech writing system in the Kremlin, that would make a great topic.
Yeah, well, I don't see why we can't do this, but also like we don't really need to agree or disagree with people here. I feel like our task here is more to elucidate and actually ask questions and then see what they reply. So yes, we do have our backgrounds, we do have some expertise in what we're talking about, but at the same time, it's not about being or like supporting a certain position, a certain point of view. Obviously, both Jonathan and you and me, we have certain standpoints where we are, but it doesn't. I don't think that it means that we can't talk to someone again, like who we disagree with. Obviously, we will have to be selective because not agreeing with Russian propaganda is not, or sort of like inviting Russian propagandists is not the same as inviting people we don't agree with. So that's a tricky one. But for example, I'm not sure that I would agree with John Sweeney about many things that he's doing. I don't know, we should leave it cut out, but yeah, I mean, it still can be a really great debate to have here. So it doesn't,
Yes,
doesn't
yeah.
necessarily mean that we have to invite people who are, say, bad or like or we don't want to have here people who stand on a propagandist position and don't have any critical thinking, or like Russian ambassador, for example. But we do want to have people of different strands. And again, it's not like just two sides. Sometimes it's many opinions. With some of them we agree, some of them we don't agree, and we might have certain positions where we agree and certain positions where we don't. So yeah, I don't see why not. And it would be really great to have these discussions here. We will probably have to be very careful as moderators, but yeah, it would be really great.
It could be interesting. We might have to put a little warning symbol, on the video, right? Caution, engage brain, engage cynicism. But we could have a, we could give it a particular branding or format that says, look, conversations with whatever it is, contrarians or whatever. But it could be interesting, because many of these people have existed within the journalistic sphere. One, for instance, Peter Hitchens comes to mind, and people will look at his current output, which is extremely, Ukraine is just a sort of, Banda right, Maidan coup, CIA kind of nonsense like that. But if you look back at his reporting from the 1990s, which he did from Yeltsin's Russia, it's extraordinarily good, some of the pieces. They're well structured, they're incredibly insightful in a way that few other correspondents of the time got under the skin of society. So I think, again, it's interesting to sort of look at that and, see if one can examine some of those things and the differences. But yeah, we'll explore all these. We'll probably have to sort of wrap this one up now, but I think there's going to be lots of interesting discussions, and we hope that they're especially interesting for experts and professionals within the media and journalism. But we also hope that anyone who is interested in resilient society, democratic resilience, and indeed rolling back oligarchy and all of these things which are very concerning trends within our societies. I hope that these videos will contribute a little bit to the resistance and the debate around these topics.
Yeah, and it was really great to have this sort of grasp into our informal discussions that we often have with Jonathan after all of these episodes, because it's really insightful and it's really great what is going on. It makes us produce a lot of questions that, as I said, like they're not necessarily very comfortable for us. I mean, I'm challenging a lot of the stances on which I stand as a professional and then as a researcher. And half of my research from like last year is not applicable anymore, for example. So, and it's a totally normal thing. And yeah, it was great to have this sort of, again, like informal discussion on this channel after we've done the start. And I do hope that there are many more things to come, and there are many more interesting speakers and interesting formats to come. We will be experimenting. Also, please do not hesitate to follow our social media. So I'm also adding some materials and some more contextual explanations there. So I do hope that in the future we can grow into like a full platform for professionals for discussions across borders, across the world, who actually yeah, who actually come together to just have this sort of informal, semi-formal conversations about, okay, what's going on now? What do we do and what's coming next? So yeah, I just want to thank everyone who is here with us. Want to encourage you to come back to our episodes, to share them with everyone who you think might be interested. And yeah, hopefully see you in new year for more interesting, engaging content, and take care.
And you too, I look forward to that.